The cool evening air of the manicured lawn felt like a judgment. Arthur stood in the shadows of a meticulously trimmed Japanese maple, the soft glow of lantern lights from his son's patio casting long, dancing figures across the perfect grass. He could hear the clinking of glasses, the murmur of self-important conversations, and the hollow, booming laughter that always accompanied his son's social gatherings. He was a ghost at the feast, an anachronism in this world of brushed steel and minimalist furniture. Then, the words came, carried on a breeze that felt suddenly cold, sharp, and cruel. It was his son's voice, Daniel's voice, laced with a casual irritation that cut deeper than any blade Arthur had ever faced. "I don't know, Mark. Just look at him over there. He just stands. What's the point? Honestly, why is he even still alive?" A chuckle followed, thin and dismissive. The silence that hung in the air after the question was not one of shock from the listeners, but of tacit agreement. To them, to his own son, he was a piece of obsolete furniture, a relic whose only remaining function was to occupy space and oxygen. A tremor went through Arthur's hand, a hand that had once held the fate of nations in its steady grip, and he curled it into a fist at his side. The pain was not a hot, explosive anger, but a deep, tectonic ache in his soul. They saw an old man with a slight limp and eyes that held a distance they mistook for senility. They saw worn-out shoes and a jacket that was 20 years out of style. They did not see the man who had walked through fire and shadow. They did not see the sentinel who had stood guard over their peaceful, complacent lives. They had no idea that the quiet, stooped figure in the garden was a ghost from a forgotten war, a living monument to a kind of honor they couldn't even comprehend. And in that moment, something within Arthur shifted. Not broken, but clarified. The illusion of family, of a legacy passed down, crumbled into dust. He had come here seeking a connection, a quiet moment with his grandson, but he had found only the stark, brutal truth of his irrelevance in the world his son had built. He did not leave. He did not turn and walk away into the night. That would have been a retreat. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, the years of discipline overriding the raw, personal agony. He would walk inside. He would face the architect of his dismissal, and with a silence more profound than any shout, he would erase his son from the only thing that had ever truly mattered, his world of honor. Welcome to Vindicated, where we believe that true strength is forged in silence and that honor is a shield for the soul. If you've ever felt overlooked or misunderstood, if you know that there is more to a person than what the world sees, then this story is for you. Join our community of story lovers by subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell, because you won't want to miss the moments when the truth finally comes to light. Arthur pushed himself away from the tree, his movements measured, his limp barely perceptible on the soft turf. Each step toward the glowing patio was a step away from the man he had tried to be for his son, the simple, unassuming father, and a step back toward the man he truly was, the man they had no idea they were about to meet. Arthur's life was a study in quietude. He lived in a small, clapboard house nestled deep in a forest, miles from the nearest town. The road to his home was unpaved, a deterrent to the casual visitor, which was precisely the point. His days were governed by a simple, unyielding routine. He would rise before the sun, his body, despite the persistent ache in his left leg, still attuned to the rhythms of a life lived on high alert. He would make coffee, black and strong, and sit on his porch, watching the light filter through the tall pines. He didn't read the news. He didn't watch television. The noise of the modern world was a frequency he had long ago tuned out. His small home was filled not with possessions, but with memories etched into the very wood. On a small, dusty shelf sat a single, framed photograph of a young woman with smiling eyes, his late wife, taken long before the world had carved its story into his face. Beside it, a tarnished silver Zippo, its surface worn smooth by years of anxious hands. There were no medals on display, no uniforms in the closet. The commendations he had earned were buried deep in classified government archives. Their ink faded, their meaning known only to a handful of men, most of whom were now ghosts themselves. The limp was his only visible medal. To the checkout girl at the general store, It was the sad signature of old age. To Arthur, it was a constant, throbbing reminder of a night in a rain-soaked jungle, of the weight of a fallen comrade on his back, and the searing heat of a bullet that had bought them the seconds they needed to escape. He never spoke of it. He never spoke of any of it. His past was a locked room, and he had swallowed the key. In stark, almost violent contrast was the world of his son, Daniel. Daniel's house was not a home. It was a statement, a sprawling monolith of glass, concrete, and cold, hard angles. It loomed over the manicured suburban landscape like a corporate headquarters. Inside, the floors were polished white marble, the furniture was stark and uncomfortable, and the art on the walls was chosen not for its beauty but for its price tag. Daniel's life was a performance of success. He was a partner at a private equity firm, a job that involved moving vast sums of digital money around the globe, creating and destroying fortunes with the click of a mouse. He spoke in a jargon of acronyms and market projections, his conversations a relentless broadcast of his own importance. He viewed his father with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. He saw Arthur's simple life not as a choice, but as a failure. He mistook his father's silence for a lack of intelligence, his humility for a lack of ambition. "Dad, you have to get with the program," he'd say during Arthur's infrequent, obligatory visits. "You could monetize that land, put in a high-end glamping retreat. We could get investors, scale it up." He simply could not compute a life not measured in profit and loss. The only bridge between these two disparate worlds was Leo, Daniel's 8-year-old son. Leo was a quiet, observant boy who saw in his grandfather something his own father was blind to. He was fascinated by Arthur's gnarled hands, by the way he could sit perfectly still for an hour, just watching the birds in the yard. He didn't need his grandfather to talk. He felt the strength emanating from him, a calm, solid presence in a house that always felt loud and frantic. "Grandpa," Leo would ask, pointing to the faint, bluish mark that was sometimes visible on Arthur's forearm when he rolled up his sleeves. "What's that picture?" Arthur would just smile, a sad, distant smile, and gently pull his sleeve down. "Just an old mark, Leo, from a long time ago." But Leo knew it was more than that. He saw the shape of a winged dagger, shrouded in shadow, and in his boyish imagination, it was the secret sign of a king or a spy. He was the only one who was even close to the truth. And it was the thought of Leo that propelled Arthur now, as he stepped from the darkness of the garden into the artificial brightness of the party. He was not just a forgotten relic. He was Leo's grandfather, and he would not allow his grandson's last memory of him to be of a man shrinking away from his own son's contempt. The warm, humid air of the party enveloped Arthur as he stepped onto the bluestone patio. The murmur of conversation, which had seemed a distant drone from the garden, now resolved into individual voices, sharp and self-assured. A wave of expensive perfume and grilled steak washed over him. He felt a dozen pairs of eyes flicker towards him, appraising his worn jacket and his quiet, out-of-place presence, before dismissing him and turning back to their conversations. He was an interruption, a crack in the polished veneer of the evening. Daniel, holding a glass of amber liquid, was in the center of a circle of men in tailored suits, his back to the garden. He was mid-anecdote, his voice loud and performative. Mark, his business partner, a man with a perpetually smug expression and a watch worth more than Arthur's entire house, laughed sycophantically. Arthur stood for a moment, letting the scene imprint itself on his mind. The casual arrogance, the effortless cruelty he had overheard, it wasn't a secret whispered in the dark. It was the very atmosphere of this place. He saw Leo sitting by himself on the edge of a water feature, trailing his hand in the illuminated pool, looking small and lonely. Arthur's resolve hardened. He began to walk towards his grandson, his path taking him directly past Daniel's group. Daniel noticed him then. His story faltered for a second, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He had hoped his father would have the good sense to remain a piece of the scenery. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying a note of strained patience that was for the benefit of his audience. "There you are. We were wondering where you went." The "we" was a lie. No one had been wondering. Arthur simply nodded, his eyes on Leo. Just getting some air. Right. Air. Daniel forced a smile, a gesture that didn't reach his cold eyes. He placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture that was not one of affection, but of control, of steering. Listen, why don't you go grab a plate from the caterers, and then maybe find a seat over there in the corner. We're in the middle of a pretty important business discussion. He pointed towards a single, isolated chair near a large potted fern, a seat for the unwanted, the irrelevant. The public dismissal hung in the air, thick and humiliating. The other men in the circle glanced at Arthur, their expressions a mixture of pity and faint contempt. They saw the scene exactly as Daniel had staged it. The powerful, successful son managing his doddering, socially inept father. It was the inciting incident, the public drawing of a line. Arthur was on one side, a relic to be managed and hidden away. Daniel and his world were on the other. Arthur's gaze did not waver. He didn't look at the chair. He didn't look at the pitying faces of Daniel's colleagues. He looked directly at his son. For a fleeting second, the vast, cold distance in his eyes, the look of a man who had seen the abyss, met Daniel's shallow confidence. Daniel felt an involuntary shiver, a momentary crack in his composure. It was a look he didn't understand, a look of ancient authority that had no place on his father's face. But he dismissed it as quickly as it came. It was just the old man being strange again. Okay, Dad, go on, now, he said, giving Arthur's shoulder a final, condescending pat before turning back to his circle, his voice immediately resuming its loud, confident tone. Arthur didn't move towards the chair. He didn't move towards the food. He simply stood his ground for a moment longer, a silent, immovable object in the path of his son's roaring ego. The battle had been joined, not with a shout, but with a quiet refusal to be dismissed. He then turned and continued his walk towards Leo, each step a deliberate act of defiance. The corner Daniel had assigned him would remain empty. The disrespect, having been publicly declared, now began to metastasize. It was as if Daniel, by dismissing his father in front of his peers, had given them all permission to do the same. Arthur sat on the stone ledge beside his grandson, the cool surface a welcome anchor in the swirling tide of social preening. Leo leaned against him, a small, warm weight that grounded him. From across the patio, Daniel and Mark's voices rose and fell, their conversation a deliberate performance for the benefit of a potential client, a portly man named Henderson who owned a chain of logistics warehouses. They were talking about security, their favorite subject, a topic on which they considered themselves experts because they paid exorbitant monthly fees to a company called Aegis Elite. The problem with the old ways, Bill, Daniel said, loud enough for at least half the party to hear, is that they're reactive. A guy with a flashlight and a dog, that's just not going to cut it in today's threat environment. Mark chimed in, nodding sagely. Exactly. We're talking proactive threat mitigation. Drone surveillance, biometric access points, AI-driven perimeter defense. You need real operators, guys who understand the modern battle space. He took a sip of his drink and gestured vaguely in Arthur's direction with his glass. Not some old-timer who thinks security is a double-locked door. The insult was so casual, so deeply ingrained in their worldview, that they were blind to its cruelty. They were using Arthur as a prop, a comedic foil to illustrate their own cutting-edge brilliance. Arthur's expression remained a mask of placid neutrality. He was watching them, but not as a wounded father. He was watching them as a threat analyst. He saw their overconfidence, their reliance on technology they didn't truly understand, their complete lack of situational awareness. They were broadcasting their strategy to the entire world, blind to who might be listening. They were amateurs. Worse, they were arrogant amateurs. Leo, however, felt the sting on his grandfather's behalf. He looked up at Arthur, his brow furrowed. "Dad's being mean," he whispered. Arthur placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "People talk," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Doesn't mean you have to listen." He then looked down at his own forearm, where his sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing the very top of the faded blue-black tattoo. The wings. Leo's eyes were drawn to it again. "Is that from the army, Grandpa?" he asked, his voice full of a child's unfiltered curiosity. Before Arthur could answer, Daniel's wife, Sarah, materialized beside them. She was a woman who seemed permanently tense, her smile a strained, rehearsed gesture. "Leo, honey, don't bother your grandpa," she said, her voice bright and brittle. "Mr. Henderson's son is here. Why don't you go play with him by the pool?" She was trying to decouple the boy from the embarrassing old man. Leo looked reluctant, but a sharp glance from his mother sent him shuffling off towards a chubby boy in an expensive polo shirt. Sarah then turned her strained smile on Arthur. "Arthur, you must be getting tired. It's a long drive back for you. Don't feel like you have to stay for the whole thing." It was a polite, socially acceptable way of asking him to leave. The disrespect was now a coordinated family effort. "I'm fine," Arthur said, his voice flat, giving nothing away. "Just watching." His gaze drifted back to Daniel's group. The conversation had shifted to a specific contract Mark was trying to win, providing security for the transport of sensitive electronic components. "These guys are moving microchips, the new quantum processors," Mark was saying, his voice full of self-importance. "You can't just put them in a Brinks truck. We're talking about a Tier 1 level logistics and security detail. The kind of thing only a handful of guys in the world have experience with." Daniel nodded, adding, "We need operators, not guards. Men who've run high-threat convoy protection in hostile territory. Real-deal snake eaters." A wave of memory, so vivid it was almost physical, washed over Arthur. A dusty road in a sun-bleached country. The low thrum of an armored vehicle. The weight of his rifle in his hands. The taste of dust and fear in his mouth. He had not just run high-threat convoys. He had written the doctrine on how to survive them. He had done it in places that didn't appear on any map, for a purpose no one could ever know. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, it was almost a physical presence. He, the man they were unknowingly describing, was being told to sit in a corner by a man who thought a Tier 1 operator was a branding slogan. The gap between their perception and his reality was no longer a crack. It was a chasm, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they were about to fall into it. The evening wore on, a slow-motion parade of casual slights and ignorant pronouncements. The antagonists, Daniel and Mark, were now fully established as ignorant foils, their arrogance a beacon in the gathering dusk. They had cornered Henderson, the potential client, and were bombarding him with a PowerPoint presentation on a large tablet, full of flashy graphics and tactical-sounding buzzwords. Arthur remained on the stone ledge, a silent sentinel observing the field of engagement. He was no longer just a father or a grandfather. He had become an assessor, his old training kicking in subconsciously. He noted the layout of the property, the blind spots in the expensive camera coverage, the way the caterers moved in and out through an unsecured side gate. It was a habit, ingrained and automatic like breathing. Then, the inciting incident for the next phase of his humiliation occurred. A sudden, piercing electronic screech echoed across the patio, followed by the jarring clang of the main driveway gate slamming shut. The elegant party music cut off, replaced by a pre-recorded, authoritarian female voice booming from hidden speakers. "Perimeter breach detected. Lockdown protocol engaged. This is a secure area." The party guests froze, their wine glasses halfway to their lips. Daniel's face went from smug confidence to panicked confusion in a heartbeat. "What the hell?" he muttered, fumbling for his phone. "Sarah, did you touch the panic button again?" "No," she snapped back, her voice shrill with alarm. "It must be a malfunction." Mark, the self-proclaimed security expert, looked completely flustered. He jabbed at his tablet, his face pale. "I can't override it from here. It's a hard lockdown. The Aegis system is supposed to be flawless." The automated voice continued its loop, the flashing blue and red security lights on the house's eaves bathing the patio in a chaotic, strobing glare. The atmosphere of a sophisticated garden party had evaporated, replaced by the sterile panic of a malfunctioning machine. Daniel was on the phone, shouting at a presumably unhelpful customer service representative. What do you mean you can't send a technician for 2 hours? I pay you $20,000 a year. I want this fixed now. His performance of control had crumbled, revealing the impotent rage beneath. Arthur stood up. He walked calmly towards the main security panel, a sleek, black touchscreen embedded in the wall near the front door. The strobing lights illuminated the deep lines on his face, making him look like a granite statue come to life. Daniel saw him approaching. "Dad, for God's sake, get away from there," he yelled, waving his hand dismissively. "You'll just make it worse. This is a quantum-encrypted, state-of-the-art system. You don't have the clearance. You don't have the knowledge. You don't have anything." Arthur ignored him. He looked at the screen, which was flashing a complex error code. He saw the frantic, useless attempts Mark was making on his tablet to bypass the system. Then he looked away from the screen, his eyes scanning the physical world around the panel. He noticed a small, almost invisible detail the installers had missed, and that the experts were too busy staring at a screen to see. A thin trickle of water was running down the wall from a clogged gutter directly above, seeping into the panel's housing. He saw a tiny wisp of smoke, smelling faintly of ozone. It wasn't a hack. It wasn't a breach. It was a simple short circuit, a failure of basic, fundamental observation. He turned to Daniel, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the electronic screeching. "It's the gutter. Water's in the main bus." Daniel just stared at him, his face a mask of incredulous rage. "The gutter? What are you talking about? Are you insane? This is a digital fortress, not a leaky shed." "Mark, tell him." Mark scoffed, not even looking up from his tablet. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not how these systems work. It's a software glitch, probably a firmware conflict." Arthur didn't argue. He didn't explain the principles of electrical engineering or the simple fact that all complex systems are vulnerable to basic physical failures. He simply pointed. "There. The breaker panel behind that plant. The third one down. It needs to be manually tripped to stop the feedback loop." He had noticed the secondary, hardwired panel when he first arrived, another detail the homeowners themselves were oblivious to. Daniel looked at the decorative ficus, then back at his father, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Okay, Rambo, you've had your little fantasy. Now please, go sit down before you hurt yourself." He turned his back on Arthur, a final, absolute dismissal of any possible competence his father might possess. But Henderson, the potential client, had been watching the entire exchange. He was a practical man who had built his business from the ground up. He looked at Daniel and Mark, frantic and useless, then at the calm, quiet old man. He looked at the wall where the water was trickling, and for the first time, a seed of doubt was planted in his mind. He saw something in Arthur's eyes that he didn't see in Daniel's. Certainty. The lockdown continued, a monument to Daniel's incompetence. The strobing lights cast a pall over the party, turning the guests into nervous silhouettes. The automated voice, a tireless digital jailer, repeated its warning. Daniel was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, furious snarl. Mark was still swiping uselessly at his tablet, muttering about firmware and calling his own company's tech support, only to be put on hold. The sophisticated illusion of control had been shattered by a bit of rain. It was in this moment of stagnant, technologically induced chaos that they arrived. There was no sound of sirens, no grand announcement. There was only the quiet, crunching sound of tires on the gravel of the service road that ran behind the property. A set of headlights cut through the darkness, then another and another. 3 black, immaculate SUVs, devoid of any markings, pulled to a stop just beyond the unsecured side gate Arthur had noted earlier. The doors opened in near-perfect unison. 6 men emerged. They were not dressed in police uniforms or military fatigues. They wore dark, impeccably tailored suits, but they moved with a predatory grace that no boardroom could ever teach. Their posture was perfect, their awareness total. They scanned the entire property in a single sweeping glance, their eyes missing nothing. The party guests, drawn by the new lights, turned to stare. A hush fell over the patio, the automated security voice suddenly sounding tinny and irrelevant in the face of this new, silent, and infinitely more intimidating presence. The leader of the group stepped forward. He was a man in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, seemed to absorb the light around them. He moved with an unhurried purpose that commanded absolute authority. This was a man who had never in his life had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Daniel, seeing the men, ended his phone call abruptly. His panic momentarily forgotten, his instinct as the lord of the manor took over. He strode towards the newcomers, his chest puffed out, trying to project an authority he did not feel. "Excuse me," he said, his voice attempting a firmness it could not achieve. "This is a private residence. The police have not been called. You're trespassing." The leader's pale blue eyes swept over Daniel, assessed him, and dismissed him in less than a second. He didn't even bother to respond. His gaze continued to scan the patio, searching. Then, his eyes found Arthur, who was standing quietly by the wall, away from the crowd. A flicker of something profound and unreadable passed across the leader's face. Respect, relief, and a deep, shared history. He ignored Daniel completely and began to walk directly towards Arthur. The other 5 men fanned out, not in an aggressive posture, but in a subtle, practiced formation that secured the area, creating a bubble of control around their leader and his objective. Their movements were so fluid, so economical, that it was clear this was not a job to them. It was an ingrained state of being. The guests shrank back, intimidated by this silent, professional phalanx. Daniel was left standing alone, his declaration of ownership hanging foolishly in the air. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he sputtered, his face flushing with anger and humiliation. One of the men, without turning his head, simply held up a hand, a gesture that was not a request but a command to be silent. And Daniel, for the first time that evening, obeyed. All auras of false confidence were extinguished in the face of this genuine, unspoken power. The leader stopped a few feet from Arthur. The strobing security lights caught the silver in his hair and the sharp cut of his suit. The entire party, the entire world, seemed to hold its breath. The stage was set. The audience was captive. The reveal was about to begin. The leader, the man with the granite face and pale blue eyes, stood before Arthur. The chaotic strobing of the security lights seemed to bend around them, creating a pocket of reverent stillness. The man's gaze on Arthur was not one of an old friend catching up. It was the look of a soldier beholding a living legend, a look of profound, almost sacred respect. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture so full of shared meaning it was a conversation in itself. Then he turned. He faced the stunned assembly, the bewildered guests, the humiliated Mark, and the utterly dumbfounded Daniel. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the air with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience. "My name is not important," he began, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, making each person feel individually scrutinized and found wanting. "What is important is that for the last 2 hours, my team has been tracking a Priority 1 security alert originating from this location. An alert tied to an asset we believed to have been lost." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Daniel, finding a sliver of his bravado, stepped forward. "An asset? What are you talking about? This is my house. The security system just malfunctioned." The leader's eyes locked onto Daniel, and the temperature on the patio seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "Your house," he said, the words dripping with scorn, "is built on land you bought with money you earned playing games on a screen. The freedom you have to play those games was purchased for you by men like him." He gestured, not with a casual point, but with a respectful inclination of his head towards Arthur. "You call him Dad. You tell him to sit in a corner. We called him the Winter Ghost." A collective gasp went through the few guests who were old enough to have heard the whispers of that name. A ghost story from the darkest days of the Cold War. "You mock his limp?" the leader continued, his voice a low, resonant cadence of judgment. That limp was earned in a place called the Valley of Whispers, a place your government will deny ever existed. He earned it while carrying 2 wounded men, one of them my father, across 12 miles of hostile terrain with a shattered femur. He was the only one of a 12-man team to come back alive. And he brought his men with him. That wasn't a failure. That was a miracle. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a cold fire. You talked about needing Tier 1 operators to guard your microchips. This man, this quiet, old man you see before you, he didn't just meet the standard for Tier 1. He was the standard. He wrote the doctrine for high-threat convoy protection that Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 still use as their Bible. He did it after his convoy, carrying biological agents that would have killed millions, was ambushed. Everyone else died in the first 30 seconds. He held off 40 attackers for 7 hours, alone, until reinforcements could arrive. He didn't do it with drones or AI. He did it with a rifle, 3 spare magazines, and a will of iron you couldn't possibly comprehend. He then looked directly at Arthur, and for the first time, his voice softened with reverence. He pointed to the faded tattoo on Arthur's forearm, now fully visible. You see this mark? His son thinks it's a picture. His grandson thinks it's from the army. It is neither. It is the sigil of the Onyx Directorate, a unit so secret we were officially disbanded before we were ever formed. It is a winged dagger, for the silent death we brought to our enemies, shrouded in shadow, because our work was done in darkness so that you could live in the light. Only 7 men were ever authorized to wear this mark. 6 are dead. He is the last. The leader, who the world knew as Director Evans of the National Clandestine Service, but who Arthur knew only as Shepard, turned back to Daniel. The monologue was reaching its crescendo. The security system you are so proud of? He told you how to fix it. He saw the flaw in 30 seconds that your experts couldn't find with all their technology. Because technology is a tool. He is a weapon. The alert my team tracked wasn't a malfunction. It's a fail-safe protocol I designed 20 years ago. A dead man's switch tied to his vital signs, embedded in the very system that ran our black sites. It's a signal that goes out if his heart rate enters a state of extreme distress. It wasn't the water in your wall that set it off, Mr. Daniel. It was you. The silence that followed Shepard's final word was absolute. It was a vacuum, a crushing weight that pressed down on every person on the patio. The strobing lights of the failed security system seemed to falter. There, artificial panic no match for the profound human gravity of the moment. Every eye was fixed on Arthur, but they no longer saw an old man. They saw the ghost Shepard had described. They saw the hero who had walked through the Valley of Whispers. They saw the living monument to a forgotten war. Daniel stood as if turned to stone, his face a horrifying canvas of conflicting emotions. Disbelief warred with a dawning, sickening understanding. Shame, hot and acidic, rose in his throat, choking him. The entire architecture of his world, his belief in his own superiority, his casual dismissal of his father, had been demolished in a single devastating monologue. The man he had mocked, the man he had wished was no longer alive, was the foundation of the very freedom he used to build his hollow, arrogant life. He looked at his father, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw the immense, sorrowful distance in his eyes. It wasn't senility. It was the abyss staring back. Mark, the smug business partner, looked like he was about to be physically ill. He fumbled with his tablet, turning it off as if it were a talisman of his own ignorance that he could no longer bear to look at. He avoided Daniel's gaze, avoided everyone's gaze, his eyes fixed on the ground in abject terror and shame. He had unknowingly mocked a legend, a man who the director of the NCS held in reverence. His career, his reputation, was incinerated. The other guests, the men and women of Daniel's world, edged away from him, creating a subtle, undeniable quarantine of shame around him and his wife, Sarah. They looked at Arthur with a mixture of awe and fear. They were in the presence of something real, something authentic, and its light cast them all as shallow, pale imitations. Sarah had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, not at the danger, but at the social cataclysm that had just occurred. Her carefully constructed world of appearances had been shattered. Shepard walked back to Arthur's side. His voice was quiet now, meant only for him. The protocol is still active, Ghost. It's time to come home. We have a place for you. Quiet place. With us. He used Arthur's old call sign, Ghost. And in that single word was a world of belonging, of understanding, that Daniel had never been able to offer. Arthur looked at Shepard, and a lifetime of solitude seemed to ease from his shoulders. He gave a single, slow nod. His decision was made. Before he turned to leave, his eyes found Leo. The boy was standing near the pool, his own eyes wide, not with fear, but with a look of pure, unadulterated hero worship. Everything his young heart had suspected about his grandfather was true, and then some. Arthur gave his grandson a small, sad smile. It was a look of farewell, a transference of a silent legacy. Then he looked at Daniel. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no triumph. There was just a vast, empty space, the space where a son used to be. He turned his back on him and began to walk towards the waiting SUVs, his limp the proud gait of a survivor. Arthur did not look back. He walked with Shepard and his silent, watchful team across the perfect lawn, leaving the glowing box of his son's house behind him. Each step was a finality. He was walking out of a life that no longer fit, a life that had been a performance for an audience that could never understand. He was walking back into the shadow world he had been born from, a world that, for all its darkness, had a code. It had honor. The party was over. Not officially, but the spirit of it was dead, murdered by the truth. The guests began to make their excuses, murmuring quiet, hasty goodbyes to Sarah, avoiding eye contact with Daniel. They wanted to escape the suffocating atmosphere of shame, to get away from the man who had so publicly and so catastrophically dishonored his own father. Soon, only Daniel, Sarah, and Mark were left on the patio, standing amidst the debris of half-eaten food and abandoned drinks. The security system had finally fallen silent, its mechanical failure a paltry thing compared to the human failure it had exposed. Daniel sank into a chair, his body deflating as if his skeleton had been removed. The words he had spoken in the garden echoed in his mind, amplified 1,000 times. Why is he even still alive? He now knew why. His father was alive to stand as a testament to a world of sacrifice and courage that Daniel had not only forgotten, but actively mocked. He was alive to hold up a mirror to his son, and the reflection was monstrous. The phrase from the story's title, "I went inside and erased him from everything," now revealed its true, devastating meaning. Arthur hadn't needed to find a pen or a lawyer. He hadn't needed to change a will or a legal document. By walking away, by reclaiming his true identity and leaving Daniel in the ruins of his ignorance, Arthur had performed the most profound erasure of all. He had erased Daniel from his life of honor. He had severed the connection, not of blood, but of spirit. Daniel was now just a man who shared his DNA, a stranger who lived in a glass house full of expensive, meaningless things. The narrator's voice, now somber and reflective, returned. True wealth is not measured in stock portfolios or square footage, but in the currency of character. True strength is not the noise you make, but the burdens you carry in silence. Daniel had built a house, but Arthur had built a life. Daniel had sought status, but Arthur had earned honor. In the end, Daniel was left with everything he thought he wanted, and it amounted to nothing. Arthur left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the quiet respect of his brothers in arms, and he had everything that mattered. The black SUVs pulled away, their taillights disappearing into the suburban night. They were carrying away a living legend, leaving behind a man who had just discovered he was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the memory of the father he never knew and the son he could never be. The finality of those disappearing taillights hung in the air, a closing statement on a story of profound disconnection. The quiet dignity of Arthur's departure was a louder condemnation than any shout could ever be. He had faced his son's ultimate disrespect not with anger, but with the quiet, devastating power of his own truth. He had erased Daniel not from a document, but from the narrative of a life lived with purpose and honor. Daniel was left adrift in his sterile, minimalist mansion, a king of a hollow kingdom, forever impoverished by the richness of the father he had cast aside. This story strikes at the very heart of a question we must all face in our own lives. How do we measure the worth of a person? In a world that screams for attention, that values volume over substance, and celebrates wealth over wisdom, it is easy to lose sight of the quiet virtues. It is easy to overlook the silent strength, the unseen sacrifices, the profound dignity of those who do not advertise their own value. We see the surface, the clothes, the house, the job title. We make snap judgments based on a fragile, superficial reality. But beneath that surface, in the quiet depths of a person's history, often lies a story of resilience and honor that would humble us if we only knew how to look for it. What is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it found in the noise they make, the attention they command, and the possessions they accumulate? Or is it found in the quiet integrity they maintain, the unseen burdens they carry for others, and the silent honor they uphold when no one is watching? We believe that true value is forged in the crucible of character, not in the spotlight of public opinion. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's true, hidden character was revealed? Have you ever misjudged someone, only to discover a depth you never expected? Share your stories and your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences are part of this larger conversation, a reminder that heroes often walk among us, unseen and uncelebrated, waiting for a moment of truth. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of quiet honor and the ultimate triumph of character, please consider subscribing to our channel, Vindicated. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story, where we continue to explore the moments when the overlooked are seen, the silenced are heard, and the truth, in all its power and glory, is finally revealed. Thank you for watching, and for being part of a community that knows to look past the noise and listen for the heartbeat of true strength.